Thank you for being with us today. I am Dr. Vincent Kolenich. I have been a board member of this great library for about 15 years. I have a practice here in Bellaire and St. Clairsville. I have the pleasure to speak with you today with my dear friend, John Kniesner. John is well known in the community, but his love and passion for library science is even more well known as he was our director of this library, the Bellaire Public Library, from 1986 to 2010. That is 24 years. On November 23, 1963, the 35th President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was brutally assassinated in Dallas, Texas at approximately 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time as the motorcade passed through Dealey Plaza. To commemorate the 60th anniversary of his death, our library has a display documenting President Kennedy's 1959 visit while still a senator to Bellaire and other memorabilia. Please stop in and visit the display at our library to honor JFK's enduring legacy on the anniversary of his tragic death. Today, John and I will read two articles from In Memoriam, A Senseless Tragedy. This was a special edition of the Saturday Evening Post, published December 14th, 1963. The first article will be the account of the physician tending to our president at Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas, and the second reading will be a eulogy given by Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. The article was written by Jimmy Breslin. Jimmy Breslin was born October 17, 1928, and died March 19, 2017, at the age of 88 years old. He is a well-known contributor to the Saturday Evening Post and other publications. He did win the Pulitzer Prize in 1986. Dr. Malcom Perry was one of the physicians that tended to our president in the emergency room at Parkland Hospital. Malcom Perry was born September 3rd, 1929 in Allen, Texas, and died December 5th, 2009 in Tyler, Texas. Father Oscar Huber was a Vincentian priest at Holy Trinity Roman Catholic Church, and he was the pastor at that church, which was very near Parkland Hospital. Father Huber was born in 1895 and died in 1975. The Saturday Evening Post was a publication that first published its first edition August 4th, 1821, and is still in publication today after being redesigned in 2013. Parkland Hospital first began in 1894 in a clapboard building and is still in operation today. And now I'll read the article from Jimmy Breslin. A Death in Emergency Room Number 1. The call bothered Malcom Perry. Dr. Tom Shires, stat, the girl's voice said over the loudspeaker in the doctor's cafeteria at Parkland Memorial Hospital. The stat meant emergency. Nobody ever called Tom Shires, the hospital's chief resident in surgery, for an emergency. And Shires, Perry's supervisor, was out of town for the day. Malcom Perry looked at his salmon cakes on the plate in front of him, then he put down his fork and went over to the telephone. This is Dr. Perry. I'm taking Dr. Shires' place, he said. President Kennedy has been shot, stat, the operator said. They are bringing him into the emergency room right now. Perry hung up and walked quickly out of the cafeteria and down a flight of stairs and pushed through a brown door, and a nurse pointed to the emergency room. Number 1, and Dr. Perry walked into it. The room is narrow and has a gray tiled wall and a cream-colored ceiling. In the middle of it, on an aluminum hospital cart, the President of the United States had been placed on his back and he was dying while a huge lamp glared in his face. John Kennedy already had been stripped of his jacket, his shirt, and T-shirt, and a staff doctor was starting to place an endotracheal tube down the throat. Oxygen would be forced down the tube. Breathing was the first thing to attack. The President was not breathing. Malcom Perry unbuttoned his dark blue plaid jacket and threw it onto the floor. He held out his hands while the nurse helped him to put on his gloves. The president, Perry thought. He's bigger than I thought. He noticed the tall, dark-haired girl in the pink suit that had her husband's blood all over the front of the skirt. She was standing out of the way, over against the gray tile wall. Her face was tearless, and it was set. And it was to stay that way because Jacqueline Kennedy, with a terrible discipline, was not going to take her eyes from her husband's face. Then Malcom Perry stepped up to the aluminum hospital cart, and he took charge of the hopeless job of trying to keep the 35th president of the United States from death. And now the enormousness of what had happened to John Kennedy came over him. He is the most important man in the world, Perry thought. The chest was not moving, and there was no apparent heartbeat inside it. The wound in the throat was small and neat. Blood was running out of it. It was running out way too fast. The occipital-parietal, which is part of the back of the head, had a huge flap. The damage a rifle bullet does as it comes out of a person's body is unbelievable. Bleeding from the head wound covered the floor. There was a medial sternal wound in connection with the bullet hole in the throat. This means air and blood were being packed together in the chest. Perry called for a scalpel. He was going to start tracheotomy, which is an opening in the throat and inserting a tube into the windpipe. The incision had to be made below the small bullet wound. "Get me Doctors Clark, McClellan, and Baxter right away," he said. Then he started the tracheotomy. There was no anesthesia. John Kennedy could feel nothing now. The wound in the back of his head told Dr. Perry that the president never knew a thing about it when he was shot either. The second bullet tore through his cerebellum, the lower part of the brain. While Perry worked on the throat, he said quietly, "Will somebody put a right chest tube in, please?" The tube was to be inserted so it could suction out the blood and air packed in the chest and prevent the lung from collapsing. A transfusion was begun with O-negative type blood. These things he was doing took only small minutes, and other doctors and nurses were in the room and talking and moving, but Perry does not remember them. He saw only the throat and chest shining under the huge lamp, and when he would look up or move his eyes between motions, he would see this pink suit and the terribly disciplined face standing over against the gray tile wall. Just as he finished the tracheotomy, Malcom Perry looked up and Dr. Kemp Clark, the chief neurosurgeon in residency at Parkland, came in through the door. Clark was looking at the President of the United States. Then he looked at Malcom Perry and took Malcolm aside and told Malcom Perry something he already knew. There was no way to save the patient. "Would you like to leave, ma'am?" Kemp Clark said to Jacqueline Kennedy. "We can make you more comfortable outside." Just the lips moved. "No," Jacqueline Kennedy said. Now Malcom Perry's long fingers ran over the chest under him and tried to get a heartbeat, and even the suggestion of breathing, and there was nothing. There was only the still body, pale white in the light, and it kept bleeding. And now Malcom Perry started to call for things and move his hands quickly because it all was running out. He began to massage the chest. He had to do something to stimulate the heart. There was not time to open the chest and take the heart in his hands, so he had to massage on the surface. The aluminum cart was high. It was too high. Perry was up on his toes so he could have leverage. "Will somebody please get me a stool?" he said. One was placed under him. He sat on it, and for 10 minutes he massaged the chest. Over in the corner of the room, Dr. Kemp Clark kept watching an electrocardiograph for some sign that the massaging was creating action in the president's heart. There was none. Dr. Clark sadly turned his head away from the EKG. "It's too late, Mac," he said to Dr. Perry. The long fingers stopped massaging, and they were lifted from the white chest. Perry got off of the stool and stepped back. Dr. M.T. Jenkins, who had been working the oxygen flow, reached down from the head of the aluminum cart. He took the edges of a white sheet in his hands. He pulled the sheet up over the face of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The IBM clock on the wall of the room said it was 1 p.m. The date was November 22nd, 1963. 3 policemen were moving down the hall outside emergency room number 1 now, and they were calling to everybody to get out of the way. But this was not needed because everybody stepped out of the way automatically when they saw the priest who was behind the police. He was the Reverend Oscar Huber, a small 70-year-old man. He was walking quickly. Malcom Perry turned to leave the room as Father Huber came in. Perry remembers seeing the priest go by him, and he remembers his eyes seeing that pink suit and that terribly disciplined face for the first time. He walked out of emergency room number 1 and slumped into a chair out in the hall. Everything that was inside that room now belonged to Jacqueline Kennedy and Father Oscar Huber and the things in which they believe. I'm sorry, you have my deepest sympathies, Father Huber said. Thank you, Jacqueline Kennedy said. Father Huber pulled the white sheet down so he could anoint the forehead of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Jacqueline Kennedy was standing beside the priest, her head bowed, her hands clasped across the front of the pink suit that was stained with blood which came from her husband's head. Now this old priest held up his right hand and began to chant that Roman Catholic priests have said over their dead for centuries. Si vivis, ego te absolvo a peccatis tuus, in nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritus Sanctus. Amen. The prayer said, if you are living, I absolve you from your sins. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. The priest reached into his pocket, took out a small vial of holy oil. He put the oil on his right thumb and made a cross on President Kennedy's forehead. Then he blessed the body again and started to pray quietly. Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, Father Huber said, and let perpetual light shine upon him, Jacqueline Kennedy answered. She did not cry. Father Huber prayed like this for 15 minutes, and for 15 minutes, Jacqueline Kennedy kept praying aloud with him. Her voice did not waver. She did not cry. From the moment the bullets hit her husband, and he went down onto his face in the back of the car on the street in Dallas, there was something about this woman that everybody who saw her keeps talking about. She was in shock, but somewhere down under that shock, someplace, she seemed to know that there is a way to act when the President of the United States has been assassinated. She was going to act that way. And the fact that the President was her husband only seemed to make it more important that she stand and look at him and not cry. When he was finished praying, Father Huber turned and took her hand. I am shocked, he said. Thank you for taking care of the President, Jacqueline Kennedy said. I am convinced that his soul had not left his body, Father Huber said. This was a valid last sacrament. Thank you, she said. Then he left. He had been eating lunch at his rectory at Holy Trinity Catholic Church when he heard the news. He had an assistant drive him to the hospital immediately. After that, everything happened quickly, and he did not feel anything until later. He sat behind his desk in the rectory, and the magnitude of what had happened came over him. I've been a priest for 32 years, Father Huber said. The first time I was present at a death a long time ago, back in my home in Perryville, Missouri. I attended a lady who was dying of pneumonia. She was in her own bed, but I remember that. But this is different. Oh, it isn't the blood, you see. I've anointed so many accident victims. I've anointed once a boy who was only in pieces. No, it wasn't the blood. It was the enormity of it. I'm just starting to realize it now. Then Father Huber showed you to the door. He was going to say prayers. It came the same way to Malcom Perry. When the day was through, he drove to his home in the Walnut Hill section. When he walked into the house, his daughter Jolene, 6.5 years old, ran up to him. She had some of her papers from school in her hand. Look what I did today in school, Daddy, she said. She made her father sit down in a chair and look at her schoolwork. The papers were covered with block letters and numbers. Perry looked at them. He thought they were good. He said so, and his daughter chattered happily. Malcolm, his 3-year-old son, ran into the room after him, and Perry started to reach out to the little boy. Then it hit him. He dropped the papers with the block letters and numbers, and he did not notice his son. "I'm tired," he said to his wife, Janine. "I've never been tired like this in my life. Tired is the only way one left in Dallas the next day, too. Tired and confused and wondering why it was that everything looked so different." This was a bright Texas day with a snap to the air, and there were many cars on the streets and people on the sidewalks. But everything in this town seemed unreal. At 10 a.m., we dodged cars and went out and stood in the middle lane of Elm Street, just before the second street light, right where the road goes down and 20 yards further starts to turn to go under the overpass. It was right at this point, right where this long crack ran through the gray Texas asphalt, that the bullets reached President Kennedy's car. Right up the little hill, and towering over you was the building. Once it was dull red brick, but that was a long time ago when it housed the Deere Plow Company. It has been sandblasted since, and now the bricks are a light rust color. The windows on the first floor are covered by closed Venetian blinds, but the windows on the other floors are bare and dust-streaked and high. Factory window high. The ugly kind of factory window. Particularly at the corner window on the 6th floor, the one where this Oswald had his scrambled egg of a mind stood with the rifle so he could kill the president. You stood and memorized the spot. It is just another roadway on a big Texas city, but now it joins Ford's Theater in the history of this great nation. R.L. Thornton Freeway. Keep right, the sign said. Stemmon Freeway. Keep right, another sign said. You went back between the cars and stood on a small grassy hill which overlooks the road. A red convertible turned into Elm Street and went down the hill. It went past the spot with the crack in the asphalt, and then with every foot you could see that it was getting out of range of the 6th floor window of the building behind you. A couple of yards. That's all John Kennedy needed, was a couple yards. But he did not get them. So when a little bit after 1 o'clock that bitter Friday afternoon, the phone rang in the O'Neill Funeral Home, 3206 Oak Lawn, Vernon B. O'Neill answered. The voice on the other end spoke quickly. "This is the Secret Service calling from Parkland Hospital. Please select the best casket in your house and put it in a general coach and arrange for a police escort and bring it here to the hospital as quickly as you possibly can. It is for the President of the United States." The voice went off on the phone. O'Neill called for Ray Gleason, his bookkeeper, and a workman to help him take a solid bronze casket out of the place and load it into a hearse. It was for President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Saturday, O'Neill left his shop early. He said he was too tired to work. Malcom Perry was at the hospital. He had on a blue suit and a dark blue striped tie, and he sat in the big conference room and looked out the window. He is a tall, reddish-haired, 34-year-old who understands that everything he saw or heard is a part of history, and he is trying to get down, for the record, everything he knows about the death of the 35th President of the United States. "I never saw a president before," Dr. Malcom Perry said. The end. Our next reading will be a eulogy by Arthur Schlesinger. Arthur Schlesinger was born in Columbus, Ohio on October 15, 1917, and died February 28, 2007 at the age of 89 years old. He met President Kennedy at Harvard Arthur also was awarded the Pulitzer Prize twice, once in 1946 and once in 1966. It is also noted that he helped with the campaigns of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Edward Ted Kennedy. Now Mr. Kniesner will read for us a eulogy.
So, a eulogy, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The thing about him was the extraordinary sense that he gave of being alive. This makes his death so grotesque and unbelievable. No one had such vitality or personality, a vitality to superbly discipline that it sometimes left the impression of cool detachment, but imbibing everything that he thought or did with intense concentration and power. He was life-affirming, life-enhancing. When he entered the room, the temperature changed, and he quickened the sensibilities of everyone around him. His curiosity was unlimited. The restless thrust of his mind never abated. He noticed everything, responded to everything, forgot nothing. He lived his life so intensely that in retrospect, it almost seems as if he must have known that it would be short and that he had no time to waste. Or perhaps it was that, having lived so closely to death, ever since he swam those lonely, terrible hours along Ferguson Passage in 1943, ever since he nearly died when he had an operation on his back in 1955, he was determined to savor everything of life. He was a man of profound earnest, yet there was never a moment when his manner was not informal, irreverent, rueful, and witty. He took life seriously, but never himself. He cared deeply, but his passion was understatement. No heart ever appeared on his sleeve, though only the unaware could have concluded that this meant that there was no heart at all. He mistrusted rhetoric and he detested histrionics, but the casualness and the dry humor and the sardonic throwaway lines, the cool precision and the compressed conference, the sense of slight distance from emotion and invariable courtesy and inextensionality of gaiety, none of this could have concealed the profound concern and commitment underneath. His whole life gave him that concern. He came from a religion and a race that was known for discrimination and persecution. He came from a family which, in its energy, its warmth, its subtle and disparate solidarity, had nourished his capacity for competition, for tenacity, and for affection. Education developed his intelligence and awakened his historical imagination. This was most important, for he saw the movement of events as a historian sees them, not as a morality play, but as a complex and obscure interaction of men and values and institutions, in which every man's life is often dim, but each must do what he can. As a senior at the Harvard, he wrote an honors essay to explain why the Great Britain was so poorly prepared for the Second World War. The book was published the next year, and he wrote in the introduction, "In studying the reasons why England slept, let us try to profit from them and save our lives from her anguish." He had the insight and the sense of language which could have made him a distinguished historian, but he was the nerve of action. The hard experience of war deepened and toughened him. He was, of course, an authentic hero, a man of valor and hope. As a young skipper on the PT boat, he displayed his capacity for command, which always meant for him not the compulsion to bark out orders, but the capacity to enlist confidence and assume responsibility. After the war, he was broken in health, but lively in spirit. Though his father had been seen as one of the most successful businessmen of his time, something had saved him from the older Kennedy's form of ethos in the business community. He inspired his children with the belief that serving the nation was more important than making money, and it was the natural thing for young Lieutenant Kennedy, pale and shaky from the war, to run for Congress for the 11th District of Massachusetts. I had been a classmate of older brothers of his at Harvard, and we were aware of John Kennedy, who was a sophomore when I was a senior. But I first knew him when he became a congressman from the district in which I live. One remembers the quick intelligence, the easy charm, the laconic wit. One did not then see the passion and the power which lay beneath him. I have always felt that in these years, John Kennedy perhaps thought he was going to die because of the unresolved trouble with his back, and that he was therefore determined to have the best possible time in the days that he has left to him. This was the season of careless gaiety, of Palm Beach, of Newport, of dances and parties, and he married the most beautiful girl of them all. But the trouble with his back remained, and in 1955, he underwent a long and complicated operation, a double fusion of spinal disc with ensuing complications. He received his last rites and nearly died, but he fought through, and he had fought through the waters of Ferguson Passage as well. When he recovered, he knew that he would live. My guess is that at this point, he decided that he wanted to become the President of the United States. He wanted to use his power. There used to be a fashion of criticizing John Kennedy for being ambitious. But if anyone ever became President of the United States who had not schemed and labored to that end, of course he wanted to be president, but he wanted to be the president not because he wanted power for its own sake. He wanted to be president because he wanted to use the power to advance the purposes of the nation. He was a supreme politician. He loved the flicker of tension and persuasion, the cut and thrust of political infighting, the puzzles of political strategy. He also came to love the campaigning. He always seemed a little surprised when the ardor of the crowds which flocked to see him, but he gathered strength from them as they gathered strength from him. But overriding everything else, he had a vision of America, of what this country might do and might be, and he had a vision of the world. He saw this nation as a noble nation, rising above the mean and ugly motives, subordinating private selfishness to public purpose, raising the standards of existence and opportunity for all of its citizens. He was receptive to new experiences, and the new experience steadily deepened in the sense of what America must do to fulfill this vision. The primary campaign in West Virginia in the spring of 1960 gave his understanding of poverty and his determination to eliminate it in new concreteness and urgency. He never could understand why the complacent rich who, for so long as they had everything that they needed for themselves, were content to starve schools, medical services, and social services for their less fortunate fellow citizens. In one of the last talks I had with him, he was musing about the legislative program for the next January, and he said, "The time has come to organize a national assault in the causes of poverty, a comprehensive program across the board." So too the agony of the Negroes transformed another abstraction into cruel reality, and so he committed himself to the battle for civil rights. He did this not for political reasons, because he always believed that he would lose some votes more than gain them doing such. He did this because it was necessary to keep the faith of American democracy and preserve the fabric of American life. He did this because he felt that cold passion that it was the right thing to do. These things deeply preoccupied him, but what preoccupied him most, I believe, was the peace of the world and the future of mankind. His historian's perspective gave him to see the conflict with communism, not only a holy war, but a difficult and perilous struggle for adjustment and accommodation. The world, he deeply believed, was its its nature and its historical movement, a devised world, a world which had room for great diversity of economic systems, of political creeds, of philosophical faiths. He respected the distinctive values and traditions, the distinctive identities of other nations and other societies. He felt that as the possessing of classes in the American community had an obligation to the weak and the defenseless, and so the possessing nations had an obligation to the nations struggling to emerge from the oblivion of stagnation and want. And he saw that this not just as a moral obligation, but as a social necessity. Those who make peace, revolution, impossible, he once said, make violent revolution inevitable. Above all, life must survive on this planet. He knew what nuclear war would mean, and he believed that the avoidance of such a war was a common interest of mankind, a common interest which must transcend all conflicts of ideology and national ambition. This common interest was the bridge across the dark abyss. His deepest purpose was to strengthen the bridge against the storms of suspicion and fear, and to persuade his adversaries that if this nation and people respect the dignity of the rest, accepted the reality of the world of diversity, if nations abandoned a messianic effort to remake the world in their own image, peace would be possible. Humanity would endure. These hopes, I believe, guided him in his terrible task. In the midst of his crushing burdens, he moved always with grace, composure, and cheer. His office reflected his own security, a world of chaos. He was a man born to exercise of power, but he was also a man who was born to responsibility of power. He immersed himself in issues, understand what mattered and what did not, mastered the necessary information, and dominated the process of government. I have so often seen experts come before him, men who had worked on these problems for many months or years, and I have seen him penetrate at once to the heart of the issue and then place it in a wider context, raising questions of significance which the experts did not know about. His presence pervaded Washington, D.C., and he infused the laborious and opaque machinery of government within the sense of his own standards, his imagination, and his own high purpose. With all this, his kindness, his consideration, his gaiety, and his strength were absolute. He had grown all his life, and he knew he could grow even more as the president. The ordeal of the first Cuba made it possible the triumph of a second Cuba. He broke new paths in a dozen sectors of national policy, in civil rights and economic policy, in the reorientation of the military strategy, the reconstruction of foreign aid, in the exploration of space, in the encouragement of the arts. But the bright promise of his administration, as he is of his life, was cut short in Dallas when Abraham Lincoln died, when Franklin Roosevelt died. These were profound national tragedies, but their deaths came for Lincoln and Roosevelt in the last act, at the end of their careers, and the victory for which they had fought so hard was at last within the nation's grasp. John Kennedy's death was greater pathos, because he had barely begun, because he had so much to do, so much to give to his family, his nation, his world. His was a life of incalculable and now of unfulfilled possibility. Still, if he did not done all that he would have done, hoped to do, finished all that he had so well begun, he had given the nation a new sense of itself, a new spirit, a new style, a new conception of its role and destiny. He saw America not as an old nation, self-righteous, conservative, satisfied in its grossness and its materialism, but as a young nation questing, self-critical, dissatisfied, caring for greatness to all those who as big as for bigness. caring for the qualities of mind, sensibility, and spirit which sustained culture, produced art, and elevated society. He was the most civilized president we have had since Jefferson, and his wife made the White House the most civilized house in America. Statecraft for him was not an end in itself. It was a means of moving forward toward a spacious and splendid America. And so a crazed political fanatic shot him down. And with this act of violence, and with the violence that followed, the idea of America as a civilized nation, the idea which John F. Kennedy so supremely embodied, suffered a grievous blow. The best way to serve his memory is to redeem and revindicate the values of decency, of rationality, of civility, and of honor, those values for which he stood through his life and to which the end he gave his life. But what I really notice about Kennedy is what this author said, how Roosevelt and Lincoln pretty much came to conclusions of what they wanted to do and were successful. But his life was cut short. In one of the lectures that I heard by Kennedy, he was talking about the things that he wanted to accomplish are going to take more than 100 days in office. It may take more than 1,000 days, or it may take much, much longer. But he said, but what we need to do in the United States is to start. And that's what he started so many things. And I particularly in terms of sending us, put a man on the moon, is helping out civil rights, and then also the Peace Corps. And many of these things that he started did happen then after his death. So it's a tremendous legacy that he has. And I think especially the Peace Corps was something that I was interested in. He came to our high school, St. Edward High School in Lakewood, Ohio, which is a suburb of Cleveland. And about 3 years later, when he died, I was in that school, and they let us all go right in the midst of classes. And I reported to the library because I was a volunteer there, and nobody came to the library. And so the librarian said, well, just go ahead, John. Just go home, John. So I did. But a couple of years later, one of the alumni of our school, that's St. Edward High School, said he would like to, for us to raise some money for Peace Corps. And for every dollar that we could raise, he would also pay that, he would match that dollar. Well, we raised $2,000. And he matched that to $2,000. And at $4,000 meant that we could build a new one-room house, new one-room school. And 3 of them would be in Africa and 1 would be in South America. And so I was one of the 5 students that went to Washington, D.C. to give the money. And this was done at Senator Ted Kennedy's office, which he's the brother of John Kennedy. And the Peace Corps was there. And they gave us cranberry juice from the state of Massachusetts. And they also gave each one of us one of these bracelets that you could put on your hand. And this is made out of the tail of an elephant. And it's supposed to, it's in the African area. It's thought that anyone that gets this is because of their bravery. Well, I don't think I had much bravery, but anyway, it was really, it was just a wonderful thing that they did, and that Kennedy, all the things that he tried to start were fulfilled. Years later, in 1979, We had the July of 1979, we had the landing on the moon, and so many other things that he started. Just a tremendous legacy. I looked at the computer, and I was looking for how many schools were named after Kennedy, and there were something like 170. But the list went on and on and on of all these different buildings. Washington's, the Kennedy Center, and the airport in New York City, and the library in Boston. Every president gets a library. It's just, the legacy is incredible. The list of places that are named after him went on for pages. Many of them were even in other countries, and they were often streets in other countries. So, I don't know, he's just such an admirable person and had such an impact on our lives. He was here in Bellaire. He was in many other places. And what he accomplished during those short 3 years in office is just amazing. So that's my outlook.
John, I wanted to thank you for being with us here today. It's always a pleasure to have you here, and I enjoy our time. And I wanted to thank all of our patrons and friends for being here with us today. And on November 22nd of 2023, pause and reflect on the life and legacy of the 35th President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Thank you.